All right, cool. How you doing, my friend?
Doing all right. Yeah.
Excellent. We are super excited to have you part of the class today. And I know my students have a lot of questions for you as well. I'm going to leave it to you how you like to present yourself, and you can go ahead and share your screen and go through your presentation. But I just want to say thank you again for doing this. We're really excited to have you on board.
Yeah. Glad to be here. Sure I am. All right. We seeing that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, let me move this out of the way so I can see my notes. All right. Um, good morning. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Of course, my name is David Candland. I am the director of UI and UX over at EA's Cliffhanger Studios. And I'm glad to be here talking with you this morning. Anyway, we'll start with introductions. You may be familiar with some of my past work, but just to summarize, um, I designed and helped create the UI for Halo, Halo 2, Halo 3, Halo 3 ODST, Reach, Destiny, Destiny 2, and then in 2018, I ended up leaving Bungie for a new position at Monolith, and I spent 4 years there, working on, sadly, recently canceled title there. But the folks at Cliffhanger invited me to come join them and help build this new studio and create a Black Panther game with them there. So I'm hoping that some of you have played some of these, well, except for the last two, of course. But some of you might be familiar with some of my work. For those of you that haven't, I've started this presentation with some footage from my work, and here's some samples. Am I sharing computer sound? Oh yeah, let's share the computer sound. All right, let's try that again. All right, in audio now. This is about 2001 here. Then Halo 2, this was about 2004. Again, another original Xbox title. And Halo 3 was our jump into high definition, widescreen, and it opened up a lot of room to kind of explore the screen a little bit more. This is about 2007, I want to say.
Was all this done in scale form, or was this done with proprietary engine?
It was a proprietary engine that we had at Bungie. It was the Halo engine, which had evolved from the Myth engine. Yeah, all like our own proprietary system. The tool that we used to author it was an internal tool called Gorilla. And then eventually, about this time, there was a shift to a newer, better tool set, which was called Bonobo. And that's what I worked in, up until, well, through Destiny, it was the same program. It was just an evolved version of the Destiny Halo Bungie proprietary engine and their own tool set. The Reach here, I want to say, was about 2010, 2011. And then from there, we jumped to Destiny, which I want to say was 2014. So this is, the work that our team had done on the original Destiny from 2014. If you've played some Destiny 2, you probably noticed some similarities, but then a lot of changes as well.
Or question, like at that time, were you like UI like artist? Because I know that the UX field like developed way later, like in the video games than like maybe like in compared to web design and all of that. But
Yeah.
were you doing like all of it with the title of like UI artist at that moment, or?
Yeah, so yeah, UX didn't really become much of a game industry thing until, yeah, right around this time frame here. So Halo 1 and 2 and 3, well, yeah, Halo 1 and 2 and part of 3, I was considered a UI artist. About Halo 3, I was the UI lead on the design aspect of things. And then for Destiny here, this project here, I was the UI lead. And that was mostly a design position. We had a couple of artists on the team. There was still a little bit of art that I did. Some of the iconography, some of the design, visuals, but most of that was done by 2 of our artists, or actually 3 of our artists, now that I think of it. And we had, you know, the art director that was also kind of working with our artists to get the visual stylistic approach and design. So most of my work on Destiny was the UX design of the interface. But yeah, there's traces of my artwork in here too. So this was about the time that I was transitioning off of being a UI artist and onto a UX designer.
Do you find it like more complex nowadays to design the games, like with all the needs, like the evolving needs, compare like to, I don't know, like your first Halo game? For sure, like it's way different.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's much more complex now, especially with a game like Destiny, where it was a live service game, and having to plan ahead, and there were still plenty of things didn't intend or plan for, and had to adjust as we went.
Dave, are you just going to lower the audio on your computer? It's pretty loud. We have a hard time hearing you.
Okay.
All right.
I think it's almost done here.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then when you were building, like, so talking about UX and UI here, so when you were building the free floating reticle, what were you using for UX though? Because like Figma or Adobe XD didn't really have that, right? So what were you?
No, there was a lot of prototyping. Andrew Davis, who was kind of our technical UI artist, he had done a bunch of tests for me that were like in After Effects, using like expressions in the layer to try and calculate the inverse reactions of elements in the tests that we were doing, and so there was some tests in After Effects and then prototyping in our engine. So anyway, now I'm at Cliffhanger Games, which is a studio in EA. And since my 2 projects that I had been working on were eventually canceled, and we really haven't released any media for Black Panther yet, besides the teaser video that we're working on, I can't really speak to any of that. So most of the examples I'll be giving are from my tenure at Bungie. I can probably safely assume, though, that you're here because you want to know more about UI and UX, what I do in careers in the field. So yeah, let's get to it. So a thing that I'm commonly asked by people getting their start in the industry is how did you get into the industry? And this is kind of my story here. So when I was much younger, I blew a lot of quarters that I had earned from my paper route and blew them at the local arcade. But I realized that that was just kind of giving away all my money for something that I couldn't tangibly keep. And so I ended up saving up all my money because my parents wouldn't buy me one to buy my first game console, which was the Atari 2600. And I could bring the games home. And this kind of drove my parents crazy. And my dad said that I was wasting my time playing video games. He also tried to convince me that art was also not a viable career choice. And so, you know, things have changed. Anyway, after getting my associate's degree at BYU, Idaho, I continued my education at the Art Center College of Design in California. And this is like right where some of those big fires have taken place. Yeah, this is in like Pasadena area. So I got a degree in graphics and packaging design with an emphasis on digital interaction. And while I was there, I lived in a subdivided house with two other students, and we all had Macs because that's what we all used for our graphic design. And one day, we networked our computers together to play this demo on the Mac that was called Marathon. And I was absolutely in love. We played for hours. The company that made it was this really young 12-person business out of Chicago named Bungie. And I had entertained the notion of trying to work there when I got out of school. But because I had really deep roots in the Seattle area, I decided that maybe I should look for work there. And so after graduation, I ended up at Microsoft making CD-ROM reference titles. These were kind of like Encarta, Cinemania, and Music Central. And after about a year or two in, this new thing called the internet really started taking off. And these projects got canceled because people don't want to get their information off of a CD-ROM. They, well, you know the rest of the story. Anyway, so that I eventually found work developing websites for a couple of companies in the late 90s during the big dot-com boom. And eventually our company got bought by a rival, and I found myself looking for work again. Right at this time, Bungie had gotten purchased by Microsoft and was relocated to Redmond, which is just a few miles from my home. So, and they had a job listing on their website looking for a website designer. So I leapt at the chance. I started developing, and I started on Halloween of 2000. So just over, 24 years ago. And so while I was there, I redesigned websites while the rest of the studio worked on this game called Halo. There was about 30 full-time employees there at the time. And then because our team was so small, I had lots of opportunities to be sort of a jack of all trades. About 4 months in, my boss came to me and said, Halo needs a UI, and you're the closest thing we have to a UI designer. Would you like to do it? And I leapt at the chance. So even though I hadn't started off doing game UI, I had kind of got my foot in the door, and that position had kind of evolved into it. But I was still working on websites. I was still, and doing the game UI, and I was also doing a lot of other things, t-shirts, posters, and just other odd graphic design jobs. But, well, basically, the smaller the company, the more flexible you need to be. The larger the company, the more specialized and specific your job becomes, because you don't have to spread yourself so widely to do a lot of different things that the company needs. So over the years, we made more games, and with each release, they got more and more complex. The studio literally doubled in each size each time we released a game. So we started off in Halo with about 30 full-time employees. Halo 2, we had about 60. Halo 3, we were up to about 120. And by the time we shipped Destiny 1, we were at 300 full-time employees. And of course, when that happens, then the studio gets bigger and bigger, the game gets more and more ambitious, and then the UI team gets bigger and bigger. So what started off as me and my boss, who was the community manager and multiplayer lead, ended up becoming a team. I started managing other artists and got to play a bigger role in defining what the game does. If you're looking for me here, it's actually, that's me right there. This was taken shortly after Destiny shipped. So yeah, after we shipped Destiny 1, our studio rapidly grew in size from 300 people to about 800 people within a year or two. And then after I left, I think they had numbers going up over 1,000. But by the time that I left, we had about 12 people doing UI. And so I went from doing a lot of miscellaneous jobs to really focusing on managing schedules, providing input for people, doing the work. But my career had gone in a direction where I was no longer contributing directly in the game anymore. I wasn't an individual contributor anymore. And I started looking for work elsewhere in the area. And so I'm a creative person by nature. And I tend to thrive in smaller organizations where I have opportunities to create and make games. I started at EA Games after Cliffhanger Studios got started. This is just about 2 years ago, and I'm very excited about the work that I'm doing. So you'll most likely find dedicated UI and UX positions on larger teams, like maybe 50 people or more, from my experience. And that number totally depends on the project. A game like Hearthstone, for instance, is 100% UI, whereas a game like Hellblade 2 has almost no UI at all. So, you know, give or take. UI jobs are much more common, and UX specific positions are almost exclusive to larger companies. So if you plan to do UI or UX straight out of school, you probably need to have related skills that allow you to help out in other areas of the game. Graphic design, 3D modeling, motion graphics, website design, and construction, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying that you can't go straight into AAA positions straight out of college or straight out of your course. As a matter of fact, I hired a contractor when I was at Monolith that we brought straight on right out of DigiPen. And that position eventually evolved into a full-time position there. But opportunities like that are a little hard to find. They're few and far between, and there's a lot of competition with seasoned developers for those positions. Not to, you know, I don't want to discourage anybody here. I just hired somebody for a UI artist position, and I had about 240 applicants for that position. Granted, a lot of them were just kind of people spitballing, like they had developed a logo for a mobile app once, and so they applied. But from that, we were able to kind of boil it down to maybe about 10 applicants among those that seemed like really solid contenders. But what I'm going to be talking about today is, you know, I've been in the business for almost 25 years now, and I've learned a few things from my experience. So I figured I'd let you benefit from some of the difficult lessons I've learned in my tenure in the industry. So I'm passing along some advice. Feel free to write these down, and when the day comes where you find yourself in a fresh new UI position, UX position, you can pull out these notes and hopefully save yourself a headache or two. So these are some pro tips that I was able to come up with. There's 10 of them. One is let people try and fail, design for the common worst case, avoid premature embellishment in your mockups, try the cheap solution first, fail fast, fail often, see how other products solve similar problems, never design in a silo. The inverse of that, never design in a meeting. never Jenga design, and don't dismiss stupid feedback. So let's just start with the first one. Let people try to fail. So sometimes players will come across features that they just can't access. One of the most common ways to block them is by disabling the button or the link. But a disabled button can be frustrating to the player, especially if they have no idea why it's grayed out. Like if I came to this and wanted to play some multiplayer and it's grayed out, I'd be like, why are you stopping me from doing this? If we allow them to try it, at least, that provides us an opportunity. So pro tip number one, let the person try. It gives you an opportunity to pop up a dialogue and explain and educate to the player what and why what they need to do to unblock the feature. Now, better yet, if you have the real estate on your screen or in a tooltip or something like that, you can save them a click and educate them on hover. All right. Number two, design for the common worst case. So many times when we're designing UI, we research, figure out what the parameters that we need to work in, and design around the worst case scenario that needs to be supported. So let's say you're designing an inventory screen, and you want to let the player see their entire inventory at a glance. So you ask the design owner of the inventory feature what the maximum number of items that the player can store, and they tell you 128. So in order to cram all 128 items on the screen, you need to make the icons super tiny. That's an example right there. So that's not very optimal, especially when starting out, you've got this big empty screen with only 2 itty bitty icons. So you may decide to rethink that goal of allowing the player to see all the entire inventory at a glance. However, as a UX designer, it's worth doing some poking around. How common is this case? You may find that the typical player caps at a mere 32 items. A seasoned, dedicated completionist player may cap at around 64. And the only way to hit the maximum is through a test case where the player would have to finish the game by never selling, deleting, using, or dropping anything, and never turning in a quest, and maxing every consumable available, and only then may they be able to hit that 128 item limit. So rather than make everybody suffer the consequences of this extremely rare test case by making your inventory items teeny tiny, try designing around the common worst case. So if, say, your top 1% cap at 64, consider designing around that. You still need to support the worst case scenario, but maybe that very specific use case can look a bit janky, like making them have to scroll to see everything. Sometimes people that are intentionally playing in unusual ways can live with kind of having to paginate once they want to see everything, because people that play this way may even kind of expect to see things break. But designing around a highly rare worst case scenario means that the vast majority of players would get a degraded experience. So here's an example. When I was making Halo 2, I had to make 16 players fit in a lobby on a standard def tube TV. And the dimensions for those things were 640 by 480 pixels. Now, to put it in perspective, if you have an iPhone and were to look at your home screen, that is the dimensions of about a size of a group of 4 icons on your home screen. That's what we had to work within. Not to mention tube TVs also had a tendency to be a little bit blurry, and they also had a really constrained title safe region, which would crop about 83% of the outer edge of your UI out. So really, we didn't even have 640 by 480 to work within. So anyway, one of the test cases we had to support was for gamer tags to leave enough room for the worst case scenario, which was 16 capital W's. Now, to try and fit all those, we would have had to have squished this already squished UI even farther, and it would have had to have looked more like this. Now, as you can see, we would have had to eat into a huge chunk of valuable real estate, not leaving any room for the map image, and then translating these two buttons into something like German and having the text still fit would have been a nightmare. Plus, if you look at all the extra unused space that the typical sized gamer tags are left with, there's just a lot of extra unused space. And so, and you know how many gamer tags on Xbox Live are made up of 16 Ws? Well, let me tell you, there's one. One person in the world that can have that gamer tag. And from what I hear, the account belongs to a tester at Microsoft. And while you can have some variations of this, where you could alternate capital W's with capital M's, these are also super rare. There's only 256 possible combinations of that. And it's only used by people whose intent is to make the largest gamer tag possible. So I spoke with our test team, and we decided on a likely worst case scenario to test against. 16 characters, all caps, no I's or L's or spaces or ones, which tend to really take up very little horizontal space. But it must be pronounceable, which means you had to put some vowels in there. And this let the text fields be substantially smaller, so we could have room for everything else. It was still tight though, but there you go. Test for the common worst case, designed for it. All right, so the next point I have is avoid premature embellishment in your mockups. So what does that mean? Basically, any design spec that you create should be reviewed by the feature stakeholders. And if you do a really rough Photoshop mockup in your document, it can come across looking, like a final layout, even though you didn't spend a whole lot of time on it. When you start adding details, it feels more final. So when that happens, people start getting hung up on these little details. Things like spelling errors or inaccuracies on the placeholder text, colors they don't like, little artistic flourishes that tend to dress up the mockup. The problem is that people will tend to get hung up on the little things that are kind of irrelevant to the design and gravitate towards that. Somebody might look at this, and this is a final image from the game, and they might look at this and go, oh, I don't really like all that red. And unless you're at the point where you're actually concepting the visual design, you just need to go with enough detail to get the point across. I tend to work in what I call gray model form. When 3D artists are blocking in an environment, they start with gray model phase, which is just blocks and roughing it in. And so I tend to not even use color at this stage. So when I write up my specs, and I write up a lot of specs, quick layout helps get the idea across quickly with fewer mistakes. As a matter of fact, when people read my specs, I suspect that maybe a quarter of them don't even read. They just kind of look at the pictures and go, yeah, I get it. Okay. So when designing a rough, I keep the mockups as bare bones as possible to avoid these kinds of hangups during the design review. So once the design is approved and all the features are known, then you can move on to the visual concepting phase. All right. Okay, next one. Try the cheap solution first. So as you design, there will be times when you have two viable solutions, the perfect optimal solution and then the cheap or free one. You weigh the merits of each, you ask your peers if they have preferences, and when all things are considered, it's kind of a toss-up. Unless you're absolutely certain, never start with a solution that will take much longer time to develop. Sometimes one of your options is a quick tweak, or even better, do nothing and see how bad it really is. Maybe it's not as bad as you originally thought. So this takes me back again to developing Halo 2, the lobby there. So what we're seeing is the lobby for Halo 1. And one of the problems with the original Halo was that all the controllers plugged into the Xbox could drive the UI at the same time. It got a little frustrating at times when two people inadvertently were taking control of the lobby and kind of fighting against each other, trying to set up a split screen game. Sometimes when somebody would hit the start button, other people would hit it again and it would reset the timer, and it was a little frustrating. And so in Halo 2, we were having to do this over the internet. And so we were like trying to figure out, well, when we're doing split screen, do we need to have some kind of, special feature that allows people to abdicate leadership to the other person. So we thought of ways to determine which controller would get chosen to be the one that controls the UI, how somebody could say, no, I want this controller to be the one driving the UI and take control of another player when that person wanted to relinquish control. We even talked about setting up voting for features. But eventually we realized that we were overthinking the process. For split screen, we just always make the controller number one would be the leader. That's it. If people on the sofa didn't like the choices of the leader, they could just ask for the controller or punch them in the arm. We called this an arm's length resolution. It was a much simpler solution. And better yet, we found that a costly feature wasn't even going to be necessary. When I was at Monolith, we were working on a project with a list where we would track quests. Pretty common thing you see in a lot of RPGs. And the way I designed it was that the list would have a sort order that grouped quests by region, then by level, then within the level alphabetically. In the spec review, it was suggested to list by region and then by the order that you received it, descending. So we started discussing the merits of each. We asked the engineer how much work it was for each, and region and order in which they were order which they received were just free. That's just the way our engineers were writing the file. So one was more organized, one required no work. And so we determined to opt for the free one to see how it feels and just evaluate. Come to find out, each region typically only had 2 to 4 quests per group, so sorting those alphabetically wouldn't have made much difference at all. So all things considered, if you're tossing back and forth between 2 design options, try the cheaper or free one before going in and doing a bunch of work to find out the cheaper solution was either better in the first place or playing with it. Playing with it should help you figure that out. So sometimes a better one is still better, but not enough better to warrant the extra cost. All right, on to number 5. All right, fail fast and fail often. So this next pro tip is closely related to the last one. A design in practice will always tell you so much more than a design in theory. So this is one of my favorite books on the design process, Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. And it is the story of Pixar and their approach to the creation process. Now, one thing this book stood out to me, in the book, it stood out to me above other things. It said, one of the hallmarks of the Pixar culture is learning to be wrong as fast as they can. Rejecting failure and avoiding mistakes seems like high-minded goals, but they're fundamentally misguided. Making mistakes and experiencing failure is never fatal if a creative organization values learning from the failure by baking failure into the creative process. So there's a great quote here, and I'm just going to take a moment and let you guys read this. All right, I really love this idea. Does this mean that we don't plan ahead? No. It does mean, though, that iteration should be an intrinsic part of your design process, and not spending too much time planning every last little detail, because those get sussed out as you start to play and actually use the function, the feature that you design. So I can't stress enough how important research is, but there is a temptation to look at other video games and simply copy them. I mean, it happens a lot. Sometimes that works. And if you can improve upon the design in that game, as if it was like your first iteration. You can learn a lot from playing something in another game. However, to make a design special, you may find yourself doing something that no other game has done before. And when there's no other game precedents to look at, this is why it's super important to that your research turns to other products outside of games that may solve similar problems. So when we were in the process of porting Destiny 2 to the PC, we had to decide how the mouse would behave. Because the console version of Destiny counter-scrolled objects using the free cursor, it felt very un-Destiny-like to turn off the counter-scrolling. In addition, some elements were inaccessible or hidden without some counter-scrolling, and so the problem was because a mouse, with a gamepad, it moves at a fixed speed. With a mouse, you can fling that thing as fast as you want, depending on your mouse sensitivity, and so it could cause elements in your screen to just fly around. And even worse, when you move that fast, if you're trying to hit a button in space and you zip up to that really fast, that button will actually counter scroll and move out of the way of your target. So it was very jerky and also made the buttons just hard to hit. So before I started prototyping, I started researching Flash sites and others that had elements that reacted to cursor movement. I found that some would pivot elements, some would put in a slight delay, allowing the UI to just kind of catch up to the cursor. Some counter-scrolled with inverted parallax, and this saved me some time in prototyping because it took me in directions that I hadn't thought of. Ultimately, the best solution ended up being just cutting the amount of parallax down by 80%. So the movement was pretty subtle, and it was able to bring in some of these off-screen elements. But this is an example of turning to a very adjacent product. Sometimes the best inspiration comes from seeking out real-world objects that solve similar problems. Doors that provide affordances, packaging that hints at its functionality, buttons on electronic components, car dashboards. Someone somewhere has come up with a solution for a similar problem you're trying to solve, and hinting at these conventions in kind of an abstract way may allow you to quickly get the idea across to the user. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
When you showed the example with the floating cursor,
Yeah.
if you had like basically a working concept for it and how it functions, when you're a UI and when you're a UX UI artist and you're trying to like create a portfolio with something like that, but you don't have a team of engineers and like other people working with you, how do you present something like that in your portfolio?
The way that we did that to try and like sell that idea was we just opened up After Effects, and in our layers we put the background elements as separate objects that we stacked, and then just move the cursor around just using keyframes. The problem is getting the cursor to sync with the background elements, and so Andrew, our technical artist, came up with this script that basically said, copy the translation of this cursor element and copy it to these background elements with a multiplier of, times, 1.2 or something like that. So that or like negative 1.2 or something like that. So when you move this way, the elements would move the other direction. Actually, it wasn't 1.2. It would have been like 0.8 or something like that. So they would move in the opposite direction with, maybe 80% the amount of speed that your cursor was moving. And so that's how we kind of visually prototyped that. And that's, something like an artist can do without having to employ an engineer into, trying to do this. And then, when you do your portfolio, you could put that video, just on your website.
So would you say that it's worth like learning a little bit of coding so that you can do some of these things as well?
Yeah, learning a little bit of coding is always good. Like if you are working in Unreal, they've got like a node-based approach, but it's still, you have to have kind of some fundamentals of coding. When I was in school, I learned some coding, very basic, and it's not really code, it was just scripting. But I learned some scripting using, and this will date me, we were using Director Shockwave. It was kind of like the equivalent of Flash, except using a non-vector based system, and it was a lot more robust. But it also had scripts that you could do, and I learned how to script that way. And then when we started working in websites, I learned a little bit of, writing little bits of code, nothing too dramatic. But that foundation of having knowledge of how scripts and code kind of work, just the basic concept of that allows you to, like in Unreal, if you're doing a blueprint and stringing these widgets together, a knowledge of how that works is super useful. And then if you have a bug, like your engineers have created something and there you get a bug that says, hey, this thing is turning yellow instead of green. You could just fix it yourself by going into the blueprint and finding where the engineer hooked up the shift in color and adjust it that way. It's much better to have an artist be able to do that rather than, you sending it back to an engineer and telling what color you want. It's just quicker that way to be able to fix your own small things. Now, for a more complex thing, you probably still want to have an engineer do it unless you feel really comfortable with that. But having a knowledge of scripting and coding and that kind of thing is super, super useful, even if you're not expected to do that primarily. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about number 7, never design in a silo. So everybody has their own set of experiences and traits. We're all different, and because of this, things that may make total sense to one person may confuse others. And one of the most important steps in the design process is seeking out and accepting critique and feedback from others. This is especially important if you are working on large features that impact multiple teams. So when I think through a design, one of the first things I do is do a quick gut check with another designer. It's only through getting a fresh perspective that you can find the issues with your plan or generate new ideas. So involving another person in the design process can take you in directions that you never even thought of, which you, by definition, cannot do by yourself. So discussing the feature, talking through the issues with others prior to going to the drawing board with your notes will give you a much broader perspective of the things that you need to be considering. So thinking back on the best, most innovative UI that I've ever had, time to work on and design, the design came from a team effort with iteration, feedback, and input from many members of the team. That said, don't play the game of trying to please everybody. Great designs can be innovative and disruptive, but there is risk involved. Playing it safe by making sure everybody is 100% happy will have you end up with a mediocre or forgettable experience, which nicely segues into my next tip. Never design in a meeting. So what's worse than designing by yourself in a vacuum? Designing by committee. So there's a saying that goes like this: if you took 20 people and made them all reach a consensus about where to go get lunch together, you would eat pizza every day. Pizza's safe. Nobody hates it, but it's also not very adventurous or memorable. Designing by committee will produce very safe, predictable results. Often the design of choice will come from the most vocal person in the room, that may have a tendency to steamroll over other better ideas. So you're also forfeiting the time to research, consider, experiment on a design in favor of one that's just kind of thrown together in 30 minutes. Or worse, you start designing in a meeting and various people present will begin to each assume the role of designer and throw out all sorts of ideas that have a way of becoming the plan of record. So if you get pulled into a meeting where the agenda is basically, let's sit down and figure this out, be wary that people may want to solve the design right there on the spot. So my advice to you would be to try and steer the conversation to identifying the issues, identifying the resources that you'll need, and defining the goals of the feature. And from there, you say, okay, I've got enough to go on. I'll touch base with each of you and let you know when I have something ready to present. All right. So from there, you can research, study, and come up with a design, bounce your ideas off of others, and then meet again to review the spec. It's also best to give the spec out ahead of time in email, so there's no surprises, and that everybody has a chance to study it beforehand and give feedback and allow you to adjust the design accordingly before the spec review. Because nothing can derail a spec review like people voicing objections and critique, and potentially even changing the design when what you're trying to do in a spec review is just get sign off by all the feature stakeholders. Okay. All right, let's move on to number 9, never Jenga design. Okay, so some of you are probably wondering what this means. Of course, Jenga is a game where you just stack blocks and carefully remove a block from the bottom and then stack it on top. The stack then becomes more and more unstable until it eventually falls. So sometimes when you design and build a UI, you have a really solid plan. It works well and it's totally intuitive. But then during the development process, and this always happens, a feature will get cut, and then another. And in the UI, you could surgically remove the UI that supported that feature, but often you may find that the screen that you removed may have been serving some other purposes other than that one cut feature. Maybe it was the only place a player could go to get information that's now not accessible. Maybe it had served as a great landing point with access to other screens. Whenever you remove a piece of UI from the game, you have to step back and evaluate the impact of the rest of the UI and compensate if necessary. So what can be worse than dealing with cut features is when late additions get piled onto an interface and you try to shoehorn it into the existing structure that wasn't designed to hold it. This can happen either during production or in post-ship updates that get sent out. This kind of thing is particularly common in games that have live content updates. So here's an example, like especially on mobile, actually. So when adding new features without a plan can send you into a battle of one-upmanship, of competing UI elements trying to vie for the player's attention. So let's say you ship a game on a portable device that has a neatly categorized main menu of 4 items, A, B, C, and D. And then a new feature is added. It's another type of feature number, letter B, but it's a much more cooler special B. So you're asked to put it at the top level instead of within the existing B hierarchy. And then we add more items to the A menu, so it needs a little blammy to advertise this. And then we find that A and B plus are dominating the hierarchy when C should still be the most important thing. So we're asked to make it red because people aren't clicking on it anymore. And then the owner of feature B plus doesn't like that it is taking away from its former glory. So in the next update, we get an update to B plus. It's now B plus plus. And then nobody's clicking on poor option B, so it becomes blinking in yellow. And now we have Times Square or the Las Vegas Strip. It's sensory overload. So I'm being a bit facetious, but we've all seen this happen to a lesser degree in many games that get regular feature updates. More often than not, these are the games that are meant to encourage player spending. The problem is that when everything is uniquely loud, the clarity and usability are diminished from the original product. and our Jenga tower is starting to lose stability due to the crap that we've piled on top of it. So the right thing to do when a feature gets pulled or added is to step back and reevaluate the information architecture as a whole and come up with a cohesive solution. In this case, if showcase features are going to be continually added, plan into the design a special location for whatever the latest big thing is for each release. So when we design the space with intent, it not only becomes more compelling because we framed it appropriately, but it also gives off much less of a slapped on vibe that can cheapen the player's perception of the game's quality. All right, on to our final tip of the day. Don't dismiss stupid feedback. Let's talk about this. Sometimes during the development cycle, your colleagues or participants in a user study will take issue with something in the design. Sometimes they have very valid concerns, and sometimes they may have a concern that seems unfounded, or worse, propose solutions that seem like the worst idea ever. So closeness and familiarity with a feature is a double-edged sword. You're so near to the project that you know exactly why everything works the way it does, but you can be so close that you fail to see the problems. Sometimes you can get a complaint in an online forum, accompanied by a pretty dumb proposal how to fix the issue. Those kind of things are pretty easy to be dismissive of. But underneath it all, we're talking about a person that is not liking something about the experience. More importantly, for every one person that vocally complains about an issue, there's dozens other that are just kept their mouth shut about it. Maybe the feedback is only bad because they're having difficulty recognizing what the real issue is. So there's a saying that goes like this. When people tell you something's wrong or doesn't work for them, they're almost always right. But when you tell them exactly, when they tell you what exactly they think is wrong and how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. I love it because it's so true. People always know when they're happy, when they're unhappy. They may not always know why, and unless users are experts in the experience they're having issues with, they almost certainly have no idea how to solve that problem or have any idea what the variables are all involved. The trick for you as a designer is not to easily dismiss feedback, no matter how bad it is, because there's likely an underlying issue there that you may need to dig into, research, and address. All right, so I hope you found this all helpful. And even if you don't end up in a UI or UX design position, a lot of it still holds true. So I'd like to thank you for your time and for listening this morning.
Awesome presentation, David.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great. Does anyone have any questions for David?
Yeah, thanks, David, for coming in today to our class. And I want to ask you, well, basically, you've mentioned that out of 200 and something applicants, you found this singular UX UI designer. How he or she excelled in your eyes and in your colleagues' eyes, and why you've picked them? And if you could give us some advice on that side.
So you're talking about when I get job applicants for a position?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me start by saying when somebody like me opens a position and we get flooded with a lot of resumes, the number one thing you can do is put a URL link to your resume, or to your portfolio. Because if we are hiring somebody like in an artistic position, we got to see if they're any good at art. And so if there is not, like if I'm going through all these and I have to go fast. So the first thing I do, like if I'm hiring an artist, I will click on the portfolio link. And if the first thing I see doesn't impress me, then I'm like, nope, and then move on. So it's all about getting, making that first impression. I confess that like the last time I did this, I didn't, like people spend a lot of time worrying about, how good their resume looks. There are times when I don't even see the resume. I just see like the data input in it, and so everybody's resume looks the same to me. Depending on the company, some companies will actually let you see the PDF or whatever. And if you click to their website, sometimes you can see the PDF there. It's really about getting that portfolio link right there at the top. For a design position where you don't need to go see a portfolio, I think the next thing that I do is look and see what the person has done in the past. And if I am familiar with the games that they've worked on, I can go, oh yeah, that had great UI design, or oh wow, that kind of stunk, and that's another pass. Now, if I'm hiring for an entry-level position and the person doesn't have any experience in design is a really difficult thing to prove. Like a lot of people say, well, I've got great ideas, but there's no way to back it up. I've found that in the studios that I've worked at, almost all the designers never started out as designers. They got their foot in the door in QA, UI art, other different disciplines. Sometimes you can get in if you have some way of proving that your design ideas are good. Sometimes, like for a UX designer, that can come in the way of like design specs that somebody can review, flow charts, things that show your design process or your research or something like that. If there's a shot of your Miro board or a Figma prototype, all that is really good. But it's all about getting your best stuff out there as quickly as possible, like at the top of your resume. If you have a website and it's super important, or an art station or some way for us to see your work as quickly as possible, because if we're flipping through a bunch of these, it's all about, what can you do in 10 seconds, So now applying for a smaller role, like at an independent game, I don't have a lot of experience there, but I think it's still about making a good impression.
What are the
Yeah, and maybe showing that you're a little bit more inclining to be a jack of all trades, kind of, probably. Yeah.
A follow-up question on that would be, what exactly are you looking for into a candidate's portfolio?
Yeah, that's a good one, Stefan.
Okay. So it really depends on the position. So if I am hiring for a UI, like strictly UI art position, which is the last two people I've hired, it's been about how talented they are as an artist. Do they have like good design sensibility visually? Do they have a good sense of what makes up good visual design? And just if they're good, I mean, that's what I look for. Now, if the position is a little more hybrid, like they do art, but I also want them to do implementation, then I'm definitely going to want to see examples of, some of the things that, like, oh, I created this myself in Unreal, or if they have examples of, I don't really ever look at code, but if it says that I authored this myself, or I built this thing to function, then I'm like, oh, okay, that's good to know. If it doesn't have that kind of information, and I just see the visuals, then I might just do a quick pass, because it's like, well, I can see they can draw, but I don't know if they can implement. If I'm looking for somebody that's like UX design and they don't have any previous work that I can reference as something they've worked on, yeah, I'd have to see the design specs, and it's not something that you can just flip through in 10 seconds to know if they're any good or not. I'd have to spend a lot more time on that. For a UX designer, I have not hired anybody like straight out of school for that. It's one of those things that's kind of hard to prove that you've got good ideas. And so I don't have experience looking. Well, no, I take that back. We did hire. This was years ago. But a lot of times, yeah, it's there have been times when, and I don't know if this is probably frowned on nowadays, but we used to offer design tests that the player could, or the interviewee could show their thinking process. And so we had one when I was at Bungie that basically said, you know, you're given 10 herbs and 10 potions, and you can combine them in different varieties to create new things. You know, it's kind of the Resident Evil potion crafting model. How would you design a UI that works in a way? And so we would have people do that, and we would look at their tests and review those, and it would show their thinking process. This is another question that we ask people. Well, I've only asked this once. I had a producer that used to ask this all the time. He says, would you rather eat a whale-sized burrito or a burrito-sized whale? And then we would just sit there and see what the person says. And the wrong answer is a whale-sized burrito or a burrito-sized whale, because they're just like spitting something out. But if they start asking questions like, well, is the whale alive? Is the burrito, can you refrigerate the burrito? You know, and asking questions and things like that, then you kind of understand, okay, this person thinks things through. I like to see their thinking process, and so you may get a weird question like that in an interview. But it also helps show, you know, what your thinking process is. I interviewed at Valve once, and they had me basically design a UI just right there on the spot on a whiteboard, and give me like 20 minutes to do it in. And so that's another tactic I've seen used in the past. So
I had a question also about the hiring process. I'm seeing a lot of blockers on job descriptions where the requirements are, you know, you need to have been in the full production cycle and have released a AAA game. What are your feelings on that, especially with the market the way it is, where people have gotten laid off in the middle of a cycle, or
yeah.
they come in the middle of a cycle? You know, how do you kind of combat that? Because I actually have 16 years of experience in UI UX, and I've gotten
Mhm.
rejected at the last round because of that.
Mm. My thought on that is that there have been times when I've put requirements down on a job description that somebody comes and submits a resume and they qualified for 4 out of 5 things, or, you know, 3 out of, you know, 4 things, or something. Like there's one thing that they didn't have. If the person is looking like a good candidate, it's like, you know, you can kind of look past that. It does tend to it does weigh in there, 'cause it's not about the candidate so much as the competition. So like if I have somebody that has shipped like 2 games and somebody that has not shipped any, then it kind of can tip the scales a bit. Now, if you've got 16 years experience in the field and you've been working in AAA, that can also kind of tip the scales against somebody that's pretty new to the, you know, it's yeah, I don't know what better to say other than it's not about your qualifications. It's about how you compare to other people that are also applying. Unless you apply for a job that has no other applicants, and then then that's when you'd be concerned if they still don't take you. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Anyone else?
I have another question.
Sure.
Would you say that game jam experience is a good place, is good to place in your resume for the purpose of getting a job in the
Mhm.
at a larger company?
Oh, sorry, I didn't catch what the question was. Say
Oh,
that
sorry.
again.
Would you say that game jam experience is good
Oh,
to
game
place in
jam.
your resume for the purposes of getting a job in a larger company? Like, is it worth anything? Is it
Um, okay. I don't know a lot about game jam. I have kind of a vague idea of what it is. Can you go into a little more detail for me?
so what game jams are basically like sort of pseudo competition, like very
Oh,
competition
okay.
light stuff that where a bunch of people come together. You find yourself a team or you already have a team, and the purpose is to create a game that fits a theme that's set by the game jam in
Mm,
under a certain amount of time. Some are like 24 hours, some are like a week,
right.
some are like a month.
Okay.
So you just whatever you finish by the end of the time limit, that's what you submit, and then people
Yeah,
will play and judge your work.
I think that's totally valid. As a matter of fact, one of the people I hired actually, they were coming straight out of DigiPen, and that's all they had was like little game jam type projects. Also, it's kind of, I in my experience, we've called those hackathons. I guess game jam is probably a little more structured, where you have maybe a little more time and you have specific criteria that you got to hit. But that's all totally valid stuff. Especially if you don't have a shipped game under your belt, that you at least have something to show that is an example of your work is super valuable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I do have a question, but it's more on the perspective that I am a project manager at Ubisoft at the moment, and I am like trying to change career. But I'm hearing like a lot of question at the moment, like people are asking about like the skills and all of that. But how much would you say weights in the balance when you're talking about like soft skills versus the hard skill, which
Mm.
is like the
Yeah.
art stuff? Because uh to be like I am working with artists, but sometimes they might not be the best, but they want to learn and they are like self-drive. They have a good attitude. They are bringing like life to the team, and they are nice to work with. How would you say like it weights like in between like the two skills, like the art skill and the soft skills?
Quite a bit actually. Soft skills are not something you can put on your resume though. That's like easy to work with, gets along with others, that kind of thing. That is all the stuff that you kind of suss out in an interview. And I had an interview I was doing once a while back where the person had some really good, chops. I mean, they had really good design skills. This happened more than once actually. Really good qualifications. We brought them into an interview, and you could see that when they referred to their old job, they brought up a lot of drama, rolled their eyes, talked about how none of their bosses ever were any good. And it's like, I really don't need to hire somebody that's going to amplify the drama in my workplace, you know? Or somebody that was really good, had great skills, beautiful designs, but was kind of an abrasive personality. It's I hate to say it, but it's usually a no. If if I don't want to bring that into the workplace, I want somebody that um, is going to be a team player, is not going to amplify the drama in the studio, and um, because I'd rather make games, not have to discipline or bring interpersonal issues into things. And so those are super important, but you don't know that kind of stuff until actually you get into the interview. And usually an interview loop, at least in AAA, involves multiple people, multiple interviews. And you're trying to see if this person is going to, be a good contributor to your team. And that's definitely a factor.
I was wondering, thank you for coming. It was
Mhm.
great.
No.
How do you approach kind of like the cost benefit analysis of like innovation versus like recreating the wheel? What kind of do you think through when you're doing that?
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, when you're talking about recreating the wheel, I kind of assume that means like building upon existing conventions, and there's something to that. Um, when I was at E3 like 15 years ago, I was on the floor and I was playing this tank game, and I was driving around. It was in first person. It was kind of like Battlezone, and then I hover over another tank, and the crosshair turns green, and so I don't shoot. And then I see another one, and I see the crosshair turn red, and I start clicking on it. And the guy was yelling, "No, no, no, no! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! That's friendly." And I was like, "Friendly?" And he goes, "Yeah, red means stop, green means go, shoot." and so I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's. I mean, I understand what you're trying to do there, but that's like going against established conventions in games." I didn't say that. I'm just thinking that. But so like when you talk about redesigning the wheel, yeah, sometimes it's like, do I use an existing convention that's going to get the idea across much quicker because people understand, because they've seen this a million times before? Sometimes that can be super helpful. When you're talking about like a major innovation, though, it's usually around solving a problem that is either a problem with existing conventions or a problem with trying to solve something that your game is doing, an innovation that your game is doing unique to other compared to other games. So that's kind of yeah, if it's something that's simple that you can use an existing convention, I would just keep using the wheel in some kind of iteration of that. If you're trying to solve something that nobody else is doing, or there is something problematic with an existing convention, then maybe that's probably the hardest one to sell to people. Is there's something really problematic with this convention, I'd like to propose a different way of doing it. But those ones, the innovation and trying new things definitely is a little more costly because it does take some time to prototype it and test it and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. That answers.
I have a question. And I don't know if anyone else would have any questions after this, but when you were developing the free roaming reticle for Destiny, what was your biggest hurdle? Or how did you try to convince other people that this is a good idea? Did you have any pushback?
Well, yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking.
No, it's so good, it's so good.
Yeah. No,
When you-
the number one reason why I got buy off on this was that it was our creative director's idea. He was like, "Hey, I play RPGs like Diablo or something like that. You got your inventory, and it's just so much easier to just click on things and do that. But how do you do that with a gamepad?" He says, "Figure it out." And so so I had the backing of our creative, head. This was Jason Jones over at Bungie. And so that kind of gave me a lot of leeway. But as a UX person that is trying to figure out the feature set, it's really about getting it in the game and letting people try it. And definitely were detractors, people that didn't like the idea, and we just kind of was like, just trust us on this, and I think overall it was a success. I think though it was trying to solve a very specific problem And so sometimes I'll see a game now that has a cursor like that when they're not, there's only 3 selectable items on the screen. I'm like, I don't know if you really needed that, so but yeah, I think one of the things to try and help with convincing is showing people all your research. That can go a long ways. If you have like a board, like a Miro board, but it has all your research on there and things, and you can step people through that in the design review, that also helps. People don't put a lot of credence into something you just kind of whip out and say, hey, this is what I got. It's like, well, how did you get there? And so showing your research, your goals, your problem that you're trying to solve for, I think helps get them in the same mindset.
No, that's good. Yeah, no, that's
Mhm.
one of my biggest hurdles sometimes is like when you have an idea or something, how do you explain it and how do you defend it or, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's just like, it's, yeah, I do all that. I do like the presentation, I do the documentation, the research and all the stuff. But sometimes like, I feel like maybe I'm not explaining myself clearly. And so sometimes I come back and it's like, did I not do a good job? And, but yeah, it's, yeah, it's very interesting to see other people's perspective on that. So thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, you bet.
Does anyone else in the class have any other questions?
Maybe one final one, just like short one.
Okay.
Between like a UX UI generalist and a UX UI specialist, what would you say is more in demand in than the general market? Not just like AAA, but also like indies and just like AA's.
That's a good question that I don't really know the answer to. My experience has always been in AAA, between Bungie and Warner Brothers and EA. I can only speak from that perspective, and usually that involves a larger team where you could have, somebody brought on in a very specific location. But I would say that if you are only specializing, like you're really going down a very specific route and you're just doing UI or just doing UX, that you are eliminating some of the possibilities out there for, somebody that has a more, larger role amongst other things. It's always good to have a wider array of capabilities. And so if you, let's say you aren't very good at art, but you want to go into UI or UX, yeah, unicorn, then maybe it's not about studying art, but maybe it's about studying, how to create UI and build it in engine and that kind of stuff. And so having multiple skill sets is never going to be a bad thing.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else? We're good. Again, David, thank you so. Oh, Felix, did you have a question? Oh, sorry, I thought I saw your hand. Okay. But David, thank you again so much for doing this. Really, really appreciate it. Great presentation. I think everybody learned a lot from this. So again, thank you so much. Are you planning to be at GDC?
I am. I'm going just for the Monday UX Summit.
Oh, nice.
And then
I'll be there too. So I'll say
oh,
hi.
hey, sure thing. All right, cool.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you again, David. And yeah, I will see you all tomorrow then, because we have our second class on Sunday. So excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much again, guys.
Yep.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, David.
Yep.
Thanks, Stefan.
You bet.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you.
Bye.
Bye.